One of the most popular ways to lay out web pages is to center all of the content on the page and leave margin on the left and right sides. This is known as a fixed width layout, and oftentimes these layouts will contain multiple columns. In order to create a fixed width layout, we're going to start out by creating what is called a wrapper div. This is simply a div with the ID wrapper. So we'll go ahead and close that off. And we need to put something inside of our wrapper. So we'll go ahead and create a first level headline. And inside of this, we'll say, "Hello, friends." And we've already included our CSS into this basic HTML document. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to our CSS. And to start out, I'm going to select the body of the document and set it to margin 0. Next, I'm going to select the wrapper, and we're going to change the background to a really bright color, such as orange. This will allow us to see the wrapper div when we're making changes. Otherwise, the wrapper would just be white like the rest of the page. Next, I'm going to set a width on the wrapper of 960 pixels. There are a few reasons for this, but basically this is a very standard width that will work in a wide variety of browsers for monitors that are around 1024 by 768 and over. Next, I'm going to set a margin of 0 for the top and bottom and auto for the left and right. I'll go ahead and save this, and when we switch back to Google Chrome and refresh the page, you can see that we now have a wrapper div. It has a background of orange. It's set to a fixed width of 960 pixels across, and it's centered on the page. So let's go ahead and jump back here. What's going on? Well, by setting auto for the left and right margin, we basically tell the margin to just fill up whatever space is left over. By doing this, we're actually pushing the wrapper div towards the center of the page, because this margin is applied equally on both sides. Next, let's go ahead and just style our H1. So we'll select our wrapper, and then we'll select our H1, and let's give it a large font size of 5 ems, and we'll set the margin to 0. So when we switch back and refresh, you can see that we now have a much larger font size, and it's not pushing up against the top of the layout. Now we're going to add in a few columns to this layout because it's important to know how to create multi-column layouts, especially in a fixed width layout. So let's switch back to TextMate, and we're going to go to our HTML, and just below our H1 here, we're going to create a few columns. We'll create these using divs, and we'll give the first one the ID of column 1, and inside of it, we'll just say a color like red, because ultimately we'll go ahead and set the background color to red on this column. We'll copy and paste that and set the ID here to column 2. And we'll set this color to yellow. And then finally, we'll go ahead and create our third column, and we'll set the background to blue. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to our CSS, and let's select each one of these, and first just set the background colors. So we'll skip down here and make some room to work. And first, I'll go ahead and select column 1, and we set that one to red. Next, I'll select column 2, and I'll set that to yellow. And then finally, I'll set column 3 to have a background of blue. So let's go ahead and save that out. And when we switch back to Google Chrome, we have something that looks like this. We have this band of red, we have this band of yellow, and then we have this band of blue. These are all block level divs, but we want them to all be side by side and look like columns. So let's go ahead and switch back to TextMate and try to do that. Just above where we set all of these column colors, we're going to actually select all of our columns in one selector. So I'll say column 1, comma, column 2, comma, and column 3. And we're going to float all of these columns to the left. Now, by floating these to the left, they'll actually all appear next to one another rather than stacking like we saw before. So let's go ahead and save that and just see what the effect is so far. We get something like this, where we have red, yellow, and blue all right next to each other. Of course, these divs are just wrapping to the size of their content, whereas we really want them to have a fixed width and take up the entirety of the page. So let's go ahead and switch back to TextMate and apply some additional styling. We'll set the font size to 3 and we're going to set the width to 300 pixels. Now let's save that and just see what that looks like. Now you can see that our columns are starting to take up most of the page, but we still have this weird blank space over to the right, and there's no space in between each one of our columns. So let's go ahead and try to fix that. We can fix this by applying a margin left of, say, about 15 pixels to each one of our columns. And then I also noticed that the text was running right up against the side of our columns, and in a real-world situation where you might have pictures and text in each one of these columns, you would want them to have some separation from the column edge. So we'll go ahead and add some padding, and we'll just add about 5 pixels. Now, when we switch back to Google Chrome and refresh, you can see that we have some separation between each one of our columns, but we've created a new problem. This blue column is now skipping down to the next line, and that's because we have some margin left on this red column when really it should be aligned with the left side of the page. So inside of our column 1 selector, we need to actually reset the margin left to 0 pixels. So let's go ahead and switch back to Google Chrome and refresh the page. And there you can see that our columns are now really nicely aligned. Now normally these columns would be a lot taller if we had additional text in them, but just to simulate this effect, we can actually just go ahead and set a height of, say, 500 pixels for each one of these columns. And when we switch back and refresh the browser, you can see that we now have these nice tall columns. There is one last thing I'd like to show you. These colors might look a little bit ugly in this particular context, but let's go ahead and switch back to TextMate. And I'll go ahead and select every div on the page. And I'll set their background to white and say that this is important so that it overrides every style on the page for divs. We'll switch back to Google Chrome, and when we refresh the page, you can see that now we can't see where our columns are or where our wrapper div starts and ends. So having these really ugly colors is actually very helpful when you're developing your layout. That covers the basics of fixed width layouts. Obviously, you can vary the number of columns or take things a step further with a grid system.